Parents, thank you so much for joining us for our final parent talk. I can't wait to see you at the drive-in. So today we are going to talk about something really important. Dr. Shelly Melia is joining us from Dallas Baptist University, and she's going to talk to us about how to have resilient children and an important part that struggle plays in that resilience. So get out your notebooks and pens and get ready to take some awesome notes. So I'm so glad that y'all have joined us today. We're here with Dr. Shelly Melia. She's the program director for the Master of Arts in Children's Ministry and the Master of Arts in Family Ministry at Dallas Baptist University. And prior to serving at DBU, Dr. Shelly served in full-time children's ministry for over 25 years. She's also a licensed professional counselor specializing in grief and resilience. And she's here to help us and talk to us about giving our children keys to resilience. So Dr. Shelly, take it away.
Thank you, Stephanie. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I appreciate the parents who have given up their time in an evening to watch this. Y'all are doing some amazing things with Vacation Bible School. So I'm going to share my screen with you. I'm going to try to and get us started. Hopefully you can see that. Can you give me a thumbs up, Stephanie?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, perfect. So what I'm going to share with you tonight is going to be broad in some ways, but it's also going to be narrow in the sense that I am going to speak specifically to kind of what's going on in our world right now with this crazy pandemic that we're in. But resilience really is something that all kids need, and actually all adults need. And so it will apply to really anything in a child's life. You'll be able to use this information and to help them. But I will speak specifically to kids in this particular time and day. I want to give you my email address on this slide right here, so that if you had any questions or wanted any information, that you could contact me. And then I also wanted you to know that I'm also a parent, and so I'm right here with you. And I am trying to learn and to grow in this as well. And so I have a 21-year-old, a 19-year-old, and a 17-year-old myself. And part of my goal is to help them learn to be resilient as well. And so we're all in this together, aren't we? And it's been a challenge for all of us, and none of us are experts on how to parent through a pandemic. But when we think about resilience, I want to introduce the topic a little bit. When I think about resilience, I might think of somebody like Bethany Hamilton. If you remember that story, she was surfing off the island of Kauai, and a shark attacked her. And if you followed her story, you know that just 28 days later, she was back in the water. And now she is living out her faith and continuing to surf. So we certainly would say she was resilient through a difficult time. Or you might think of somebody like Nick Vujicic. You may have heard of him, but he was born without arms or legs, and he has an organization called Life Without Limbs. And he went through hard times, just like all of us do, and struggled with the disabilities that he had, but he somehow learned to become resilient, and now he has a whole ministry speaking inspirationally to people about what can be done with God's help. And so those are a couple of people that maybe I think about. You may have family members that you think about who've been resilient, but all of us know that our children need to learn to be resilient. I think about this quote from Ernest Hemingway. It says, "The world breaks everyone, and afterward, some are strong at the broken places." Not all are strong. Not everybody becomes resilient. That's really kind of the hard thing. But we do know some things about resilience, and what we want to talk about tonight really is how can we help our kids be strong in those broken places? How can we help them to be like a Bethany or a Nick Vujicic? And so we're going to really address a couple of pretty big questions tonight. The first one is, what can I do to help my child be resilient? And then the second question that I want to touch on briefly at the end is, why is this so hard? Why has this pandemic been challenging? And the truth is that some parents are really sort of doing okay through it, maybe even doing well. And then on the other end of the continuum, it's really hard for some parents. Some parents are trying to work from home and homeschool from home, and and are worried about a lot of different things. So we'll talk about why it's so hard, and then I'm going to give you a tool to sort of assess your kids. So first of all, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on the research part of this, but I think it is important for you to understand that the research related to resilience talks about some protective factors, some things that protect kids when they go through difficulties. And I like to use the analogy of an umbrella, right? In a storm or in a rain shower, I'm going to have my umbrella, and that umbrella is going to serve as a protection. And if we were to think about resilience as an umbrella that sort of protects kids in a storm, there's 5 areas or 5 panes of this umbrella, and there's 5 things that we want to focus on tonight. The first one is on nurture. Now, the research term is internal assets. That refers to their temperament, their personality, their ability to self-regulate, kind of all those internal things. The second one is the connections, and then this really relates to the community, the external resources that they have, the neighborhoods, the schools, the churches. Those relationships and connections impact them. The third one is really more specific to relationships themselves. We know that kids who have good, strong connections and relationships tend to be more resilient than kids who don't. The fourth one is family, and we're going to talk about that in the sense of leading your family, the family dynamics. And then the fifth one is faith or spirituality. And even in secular researchers, people who aren't that interested in faith, from the very beginning of resilience literature that started in the 1970s, they pointed to faith and they said, you know, we see that faith tends to help kids be more resilient. We don't understand it. We don't really know why, but we see when we interview these kids who are being resilient that they have a faith. So those are the 5 areas that we're going to talk about and kind of dial into. These are the 5 things that your kids have to help them be resilient, or 5 keys. So the first one is nurture your child. That's that internal resources that a child has. It's a focus on who your child is or who they are rather than what they do. It's really about their internal assets. So a couple of things, 3 or 4 things that we can do to help sort of activate that pain on the umbrella in this particular crisis is to always consider their age and their developmental phase that they're in, and use appropriate language to describe and talk about events in our world. So when we think about what's going on right now, we're going to give information to a 5-year-old that's going to look different than information to a 12-year-old. Similar to whenever my kids were little and we would go to the pediatrician, he would determine the amount of medicine to give them based on their weight and height and age. And so we measure the truth, we measure our words according to the child. So we want to be careful in the things that we say. We want to limit their media exposure, because remember, developmentally, they aren't able to process things like older kids are. We learned from 9/11 that repeated exposure to watching things over and over again on the television actually created more anxiety for kids, and they reported later that they thought it was happening over and over again because they were not able to separate what they saw on TV from the past and the present. And so we as adults also need to limit that. I don't know about y'all, but there's been many times when I've just had to say, I'm not going to watch this anymore. I can't think about this particular crisis so much, and I have to sort of limit what I do. The third and fourth thing I think are really important. When our kids are going through something difficult, we want to help them remember times when they've gone through difficult things in the past and talk about what worked, and help them to use those things to go through difficult things in the present and in the future. And as parents, sometimes we have to remember, okay, how did my child deal with this? How did they deal with the death of a pet, a family member? How did they face a challenging school experience? What do I remember about that? What went well? What didn't go well? And then as a parent, we're going to build on those experiences. So it's kind of like scaffolding in education. We're going to scaffold them concept on concept. I think about a story in the Bible that I think helped young David, when he fought Goliath. If you remember in 1 Samuel chapter 17, when they're kind of questioning him being able to fight Goliath, he says, I killed a lion and a bear, and God will help me kill this Philistine. And so that's important for us as parents to be able to point back and say, hey, remember when this happened before and the Lord helped you? He's going to help you now. Okay, so that's a good way to look at it. Another thing at the bottom there is just to foster creativity and problem solving. One of the big keys in the internal asset category of how kids do is their problem solving abilities. If they are comfortable trying to solve a problem, they're going to tend to be more resilient. If they feel the word that researchers use is self-efficacy, meaning they believe that they have some measure of control and they can help solve a problem, then they tend to tackle those things more confidently. And so the great thing about COVID-19 is that our kids have had more time to play, more time to imagine, and more time to even problem solve. And so we want to continue that even into the future. We don't want to micromanage their time so much that they don't get to enjoy the simple joys of childhood. And that's that nurturing that individual child. And so those are some things with that internal assets, with nurturing your child, that you can kind of work on with your kids. When we talk about connecting to your community, this really relates to neighborhoods, schools, and churches. And we know that particularly school is really important to kids. That tends to be the place where they are the most. We know that some people homeschool, and so that's different. But for most kids who are in public schools or even private schools, school's a really big deal. And so those types of connections are important. Also, connections in your community. That could be sports teams that they're on, Cub Scouts, Girl Scouts, whatever it might be that they're in, that gives them a sense of community, is something that helps them in difficult times. So we want to talk about the efforts going on in our community to help people. I'm sure that you all did that whenever you all had the flooding, that you guys were able to point out to kids, hey, look at the community helpers. Look at the people driving from North Texas down to Houston with their boats to help us. You know, we can sort of connect to those efforts, and then allow kids to help. Kids cope better, we cope better when we're helping other people. And so finding simple ways for them to contribute. It might be sending a card or a digital greeting. It might be making a sidewalk chalk message to somebody, but giving kids something to do tends to be pretty important, because they want to help. They want to be a part of that as well. Of course, we want them to stay connected to their teachers and their school leaders that are important to them. And I think parents have tried to do that, and we're sort of winding down. Here in North Texas, we're done with school now. You all are probably winding down. But in the future, in a crisis, one of the things that we know is the best thing we can do for kids is get them back in school. Right? That's the best place for them because there's routine and structure. And honestly, we also know that some kids have experienced abuse and neglect because they haven't been in school for the past 2 months. We know that domestic violence rates have gone up, and child abuse has gone up. And so school is a really important thing that we want to keep them connected to. We're kind of past that now, but that's something that's really important. And then just always emphasize hope and highlight ways that their needs are being met by community helpers. We want to support the things that the people in our community are doing, and we also want to be a part of making our community a better place, because that's part of our job as Christians. So the first two we've passed through. This, the third one is maintain and value relationships. Kids today have a deficit in relationships. And this is where church becomes so important, is that we want kids to have good relationships with people at church, adults at church, and we also want them to have relationship with their peers at church. There's lots of different studies going on about kids and relationships, and there's a lot of agreement that their relationship skills are not as high as they used to be. Their empathy skills are not as good as they used to be, and that they don't tend to have as many adults in their life as previous generations. There's a book called Sticky Faith, And it basically says we want kids who stay in the faith community. They need 5 non-parental adult relationships in the church in order for there to be healthy spiritual formation. And so we want to be a part of that. And so as a parent, we want you to value what the church has to offer. We want you to use technology and to embrace the efforts that your church is doing to try to keep your kids connected. Churches are working really hard to stay connected to their kids. And so we want parents also to let their kids use that technology, social media, to connect with them and embrace all the things. If you're on this Zoom, then you've embraced what they're doing. You've embraced this idea that we can do virtual VBS. But some of the most important relationships for kids should be the church. And wherever kids spend a lot of time, that's where their relationships are going to be. So even as you think about the future, you may want to consider, where are my kids' deepest relationships? And if they're not with the people at church, you may want to adjust some things because they truly need those relationships. Again, applaud the creative methods that your church is doing, and reciprocate as much as you can. Keep them connected. And then we think that as families, we're spending a lot of time together, and we probably are, but just make sure there's also that time when you're fully present and engaged with your family. I know most of us are working from home, and so we're more distracted than ever. And so kids look forward to and enjoy those family times. And what we would want is for your kids, when they're talking about this 5 years from now, to say, we remember all the fun things that we did as a family. Remember that we put together puzzles, or we learned how to play a new game, or we went bike riding every night, or we ate out on the porch every night. That's different. And so stay connected as a family, because relationships are so important for kids, no matter what they may be going through. The fourth one is about your family, and is about leading your family. As parents, we are the leaders of our family. And the very first thing that I put on here was just to be gentle with yourself. That parenting through a pandemic is a new territory that none of us have experience with. And none of us have done it perfectly, nor will any of us finish it perfectly. And so give yourself grace to navigate it. Parents are under a lot of stress right now. And so I know that on social media, sometimes we may think everybody's got it together and that it's easy, but the reality is a lot of us are struggling. A lot of us find this difficult. A lot of us might even need some extra support ourselves. We might need some counseling. We might need some respite, a break from our kids. And so realize that how you respond is going to impact how your kids respond. And so in the same way, when you fly on an airplane, they say parents put the oxygen mask on you first and then take care of your kids. Remember that in any time you're in a crisis, that you've got to take care of yourself first, so that you can do a good job taking care of your kids. So give yourself grace. Probably all of us have made mistakes in this. And so we just want to give ourselves grace. The second thing would be just monitor the content of your conversations, particularly with younger kids, because they listen and they're not able to interpret or process things as accurately as older kids. And so you just want to monitor that. You don't want to be dishonest, but just remember that they're listening. And if you're conveying fear and anxiety in your conversations, that's going to seep down to them. We also want to just remind families that kids find comfort and security in structure and routine. Chaos is very disconcerting to kids. So maintaining regular meal times and bedtimes as much as possible. Even in the summer, I think we have a tendency to really relax things in the summer, and there's certainly some value in that. But just remember that security is sort of created by predictability, particularly with young kids. So keep those routines. Remember that kids, according to research, kids really respond best in families where there are limits, but also a lot of relational warmth. So some folks call that authoritative parenting. It just basically means there's limits, but there's warmth. It's not just a drill sergeant, but it's also not a softie. It's somebody who has the ability to have rules, but also express love consistently and unconditionally. And I think when we get in crisis, sometimes, and maybe particularly in a death or divorce or something big like that, we tend to feel bad about it for our kids, and so we tend to try to be nicer and maybe relax things, and that really actually creates some problems for kids. They need that structure in their life. So we want to encourage us to lead our family. So that's the fourth one. The fifth one is about leaning into your faith. And this is the one that I really like to talk about, obviously, because I think it's wonderful that even researchers who are not part of the faith community recognize the value of this for kids. But we want our kids to be able to utilize their faith to get through something difficult. Because the reality is we're all going to go through difficult things. John 16:33 says, in this world you will have trouble. You will have trouble, but take heart, for I have overcome the world. And so we've got to prepare our kids for that. And so one of the things that I like to talk about is to help kids look for God in every situation. And I like this clip from Fred Rogers. If you've been in children's ministry world for any amount of time, you've probably seen this clip. It's like a 56-second clip where he talks about looking for the helpers. So I'm going to play this clip, and then I want to transition that to how do we help kids look for God in situations.
You know, my mother used to say a long time ago, whenever there would be any really catastrophe that was in the movies or on the air, she would say, always look for the helpers. There will always be helpers, even just on the sidelines. That's why I think that if news programs could make a conscious effort of showing rescue teams, of showing medical people, anybody who is coming into a place where there's a tragedy, to be sure that they include that. Because if you look for the helpers, you'll know that there's hope.
Okay, so I love that clip because it is so true. That's in counseling, we call that kind of reframing, where we're helping people look for the good in things that are happening. But I think in faith, it helps us to say, this is a hard time, but where do we see God at work? In COVID-19, maybe we see God at work in the way our church is helping give food to people who don't have food. Or maybe we see it in the doctors who are praying with their patients who don't have family around. Or maybe we see it in the messages that we write on the sidewalk to encourage people. Or maybe we see it in the way that kids have gone to nursing homes and stood outside with signs and tried to minister to people where they're at. And so we always want to help kids look for God in every situation, because even in the most difficult times, and actually even more so in the most difficult times, we can see God. And the church and the faith community rises to the occasion in difficult times. So it's pretty easy to point those things out of what God is doing. So we want to recall and retell stories from the past of God's provision and protection for your family. This is a way to use your faith. The example from the Bible would be in 1 Samuel 7, when the Israelites defeated the Philistines. And Samuel said he took a stone and he set it up in the place where they defeated the Philistines. It was called an Ebenezer stone. You may have heard it in that song, How Firm a Foundation. That's Here I Raise My Ebenezer. And Ebenezer means a stone of help, or thus far God has helped me. And so the idea was that Samuel wanted to set up this monument to memorialize what God done, so he could always point back to, this was a time when God helped us, and because God helped us here, he's going to help us in the future. So as families, we need to look for those Ebenezer moments all throughout our kids' lives. We need to be be ready to memorialize the things that God does for us so that we can point back to those as evidence of God's work in our life. So for me, I didn't mention this, but in June of this year, I will have been a single widowed mom. So my husband was killed in a car accident 15 years ago in June. And so I had a 6'4" and a 2-year-old when that happened. And one of the ways that we sort of raised an Ebenezer all along the way was when this happened, I was concerned that my kids were gonna hate God. You know, we're gonna think, why would God allow this to happen to our family? And so I just began doing a couple of simple things. And one of those things, and there's lots of ideas, this is just one idea, but one of those things was, you know, when you are the children's minister at your church and we'd been there 9 years, people do a lot for you when you lose your husband unexpectedly. And so people mowed our lawn and they cleaned our house and they brought us food, and, you know, I could just name all these things. Every time somebody helped us and did something like that, I would just ask the kids, do you know why so-and-so mowed our lawn today? And at first they're like, no. And I said, well, it's because they love God and they love us, and that's what you do when people are hurting. So over and over and over and over and over again, we had that conversation, trying to help them see God and how he was using people to minister to us. You fast forward that, about 5 years ago, I asked the kids, it was like the 10-year anniversary, and I said, what do you remember about that time? And the two oldest said, we remember how people helped us. We remember how God used people to help us. So for us, that was a way to do it, is to be able to point back. And even now, when things are hard, I say, you know, it's hard. This is a really hard thing, but remember how God helped us. So every family's different. Every family's going to have different stories. Every family's going to have different crises. But we want to all along the way point out to our kids when God shows up. Because if we can memorialize those things, then we can draw confidence from that for the future. Okay, so we want to point out ways that God is at work in our family and in our community. And that's a good coping mechanism for us as adults too, because we can see God at work if we'll just look for him. So in a few more things about leaning into your faith, be willing to talk through your child's hard questions about God. It's okay to say, you know what, I don't know. That's a really great question. While I don't know that answer, here's something I do know. I do know that God's with us. I do know he's going to take care of us. And so be willing to talk through those questions. What we know from research is that the older kids get, the more questions that they have, and the more they need to talk through some things. So preschoolers are not going to have those hard questions. Your adolescents are going to have those hard questions. Highlight some characters in the Bible who experience God's comfort during difficult times. I think sometimes we forget that there's a lot of characters in the Bible who had hard times. If you look at the faith chapter in Hebrews 11, you know, by faith, Noah did this, by faith, Jacob did this, by faith, that particular chapter. You know, at the very end, it also talks about all the people who had really hard things happen to them, but God still called them faithful. And so we want our kids to know that it's normal to have hard times. It would be abnormal not to. So characters like Joseph, characters like Job, all of those different people, we can help kids to see that they're not the only ones going through this. Use Bible verses to instill hope and peace about the future. One of my favorite verses is Psalms 56:3, what time I am afraid, I will trust in thee. It kind of assumes there's going to be times when I'm afraid, right? It kind of normalizes that, but it reminds me to trust in God. And then to pray together daily about things, and maybe even keep track of the things that you're praying. Again, memorializing how God is at work. Kids are very concrete, and they need tangible ways to see God at work. So those are the five panes of the umbrella. And the important thing to note is that a child doesn't have to have a perfect umbrella. It doesn't. Most kids are not. Most kids are not going to have every area really well strengthened. Most kids are going to have a couple of areas that they're really strong in, and maybe one or two areas that they're weak in. So we can help them with that, but it's just important to know You don't have to have all those areas strengthened. Those are just the things that research say will help them. So why is this particular issue so hard? Well, you all in Houston, you know what it's like to have something called a population-wide trauma. So a population-wide trauma is something that impacts literally every area of a child's or family's life. So when we think about the United States, a population-wide trauma might be 9/11. A real geographic population-wide trauma would be Hurricane Katrina. Everything in that area was impacted. Schools, churches, friendships, families, everything. COVID-19 is similar to a population-wide trauma because every area of a child's life has been impacted. Schools have been offline, churches have been different, relationships have been different, there's stress at home in many cases, and kids don't have necessarily all of the abilities internally to deal with all of that. So when we look at a population-wide trauma, it's hard. And so that's why this is so hard. It's hard because the things that, for instance, when my husband was killed in a car accident, our family pain was destroyed, right? In many ways, it was very badly damaged. But our faith and spirituality was still strong. They still had their school. They still had their church. So we still could lean into some of those things. So this is different. This is what makes it so hard. And so we have to really work to sort of repair that umbrella and to use what we have. One of the things that we know about resilience is that some kids are resilient and some kids aren't, right? There are some kids who have everything in the world. And if you use the umbrella illustration, they have the biggest, baddest, most beautiful umbrella in the world, and they're still not able to be resilient. And then we have kids who have something like this little umbrella right here, where it's kind of battered and torn. And somehow that child is able to be resilient, even though they have a smaller umbrella. And the key is how they use it. So if I have a big umbrella, I have all these resources, but I don't know how to use them, I may not be any more resilient than the child who doesn't have anything. On the other hand, a child who has very, very little may be able to use what he has to protect himself and get through something. So part of our job as parents is to teach our kids how to use the umbrella they have, how to use the relationships that they have, the faith and spirituality that they have, the family dynamics that they have, the internal assets, the external resources. And the way to do that, a lot of it's pretty normal things that we teach. But if you're interested, there's a survey that I've done. It's an assessment tool where you can answer these questions. And these questions break down those 5 pains, and they ask different questions. And so I know that they'll provide this PowerPoint, but you could go through and answer these questions, and you can see there's 30 questions. And then at the end, it tells you how to score it. So all the ones that are yellow have to do with nurture. All the ones that are kind of this pinkish purple have to do with external resources or connections to community. The green is family, the blue is relationships, and sort of the gray is faith. So the idea would be that you would write down the scores. A no is a 1, a sometimes they're not sure is a 2, and a 3 is a yes. So you would write down the scores, total it up, and then you could see which one of these was strong and which one of these was weak. And then you could work on some of those areas where they're weak, but also utilize that area that's strong, right? Because again, kids are not going to be strong in all 5 areas. They're going to be strong in a couple of areas. And so we want to help them sort of learn to utilize that. So if that interests you, you'll have access to that. It's a 30-question survey. The numbering isn't right because of the formatting for PowerPoint, but the file that I can send you will have the numbering. But you'll be able to, just based on the colors, put it in the right spot and to know which area that is. So that's kind of some ideas about how resilience works that could be utilized in any crisis, with some emphasis on this particular one. So there's my contact information again. If you want to email and ask me any questions, but 5 areas, 5 keys of how we can help kids be resilient. And so I'm going to hand it back over to Stephanie see if she has
That is amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. I do have a couple of questions.
Okay.
So it's hard to see our kids struggle. Like as a parent, you don't want to see your kids struggle, right? So can you talk about how kids benefit from struggling and what kind of struggles are good for our kids to struggle with?
Oh, wow. I love that question because that's really, it's really a key, is that in order to become a problem solver, which is a really important part of that internal assets or the nurture part, you have to have problems to solve. And so as parents, it's really easy to be the problem solver for your child. And so I think we have devalued struggle. We have decided that our job as parents is to rescue our kids out of struggle. And in reality, I don't know about you, Stephanie or Paulette, but I learned some of my best lessons when I struggled, right? So if we take away the struggle, then it's kind of, for resilience, it's like a muscle. Okay. So the more that I use those things, the stronger my muscle gets. The less I use those things, the less strong I get. Now, there's some caveats to that. A child who goes through multiple traumas is probably not going to get stronger. They're probably going to be beat down. So that's not necessarily true. But I'm talking about little struggles, like solving little problems rather than us rescuing them, letting them be in a class where they may not love the teacher for a while, right? Because they learn that, you know what, someday I'm going to have a boss that doesn't love me and maybe I don't love them, but I'm learning how to work through that. So I think you've hit upon one of the most important things that we as parents have to work on, and that is being okay with some failure with our kids, letting them fail now when the stakes are lower, so that hopefully when the stakes are really high, they'll have learned from that. But I think that helicopter parenting tendency has robbed our kids of feeling confident. Just like David. If David had never fought a lion and a bear, he wouldn't have been ready to fight Goliath, right? Now, we don't want our kids to fight a literal bear and a lion, but we do want them to have some battles. We do want them to have some failures. We have kids at DBU who've never failed, and they get to DBU and they have anxiety and they can hardly cope because they've never failed before. So we want our kids to have some failures to know they can live through it, that they can come out on the other side and, we learn something and we move on. So it is really an important skill that we have to let kids have.
That's an awesome thing to help equip our parents to be able to do. So you talked about having limits and still having warmth. So what does that look like within that struggle of helping your kids have limits and setting limits, but still having that warmth in that family relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where we equate love with rescue.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes love means struggle. And so I can say, oh, I love you too much to let you not learn from this, right? Like it seems like that if I loved you, I would take care of this for you, or I'd fix it for you. But actually, love says, I believe you can overcome this, and I'm going to trust you to overcome this. So it's kind of a reversal or reframing of it. But love doesn't mean rescue. I think that's the hardest thing. And I think for us as parents, we sort of compare ourselves all the time to everybody else. I know that social media can really cause us to lose confidence in ourselves as parents, because we think, oh, well, everybody else's child is all state this and scholarships and all that stuff. And so we feel bad, and we think our kids become our trophies instead of our treasures. And we have to let them learn through the difficulties. But even in learning through the difficulties, they can know that we love them, and we can still communicate, hey, that's a bummer. I'm really sorry that happened. I love you. And have you thought about how you're going to solve that? Or have you thought about how you're going to pay for that, type of a deal? But you can still communicate love, but it's not easy at all. It doesn't come naturally.
No, that is such a great answer. That is such a great help for parents. And as we are every day navigating a different situation or new situation, that is so awesome. Well, Miss Paulette, did you have any questions?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions and I have a couple of comments. I'll go from the back to the front since
Okay.
Dr. Melia was just, saying let them struggle. And I was thinking about in nature, we don't crack a chrysalis, a butterfly chrysalis to let them out, because if we do, they won't survive, because that struggle of trying to break out of the chrysalis is what strengthens their wings to
Mm,
fly.
mm,
And if we open it too soon, their wings are weak. And I was equating that with children. They've got to learn those things to strengthen themselves, and we can't always come to their rescue. And then I was also thinking, when you were speaking of David, when he went to fight Goliath, they wanted to put on Saul's apparel.
uh-huh.
We have to allow our children to use what they have, what works for them. And for David, it was his sling and and the rocks.
Excellent point. I love that.
All of those didn't happen. And then I'll rewind and ask you something that ties into one of our speakers earlier this week, when you were saying give children space to play and to imagine and time to solve problems. A question I asked the other night is, are parents overscheduling their children's time? Because I remember growing up, we had time to chase butterflies, we had time to try to catch lizards and all of that. But now kids don't have time to just be in the backyard and just watch nature, have fun, lay in the grass and look at the clouds.
Right. Oh, I do think we're overscheduled. And I think that's one of the things that hopefully parents will ponder, that we will ponder, is can we see the value in what we've had in the past 8 to 10 weeks? Because play is practice for adulthood, and it gives kids an opportunity to learn and to grow in their own ways. And I know that Sissy Goff, I heard her, she's a great speaker, counselor in Nashville, Tennessee. And she said, with this COVID crisis, they're seeing anxiety in kids go down. Because kids are not so worried about their school, they're not so worried about their sports, they're not so worried about everything. And so I hope and pray that we as parents will consider everything that we add back in, because there's such a value. And I think our kids are happy right now being able to play and to be kids, and that we've focused so much on what they do and how they perform that we've not given them an opportunity to just be.
Dr. Malia, I was remembering when we had Hurricane Rita here in Houston. We have some elderly, well, I'm in the elderly now, but back then we had some elderly neighbors. And I just simply started calling the kids on the block. And I'm saying, hey, it's raining. We need to clean up the leaves off the curb so that the water can flow. And there were branches, I'm not talking about heavy stuff, but branches and things. And we were out there in the rain, raking up, bagging up things to help the ones who needed help on the street. And I remember a young man asking me later, would I write a letter of recommendation? He was up for Eagle Scout, and he was one of my leaders. We had them all ages out there helping the whole block.
Wow.
And I thought about it when I was looking at Mr. Rogers, look for the leaders. I simply had to ask, and they all showed up. And
Right.
we did what we could for our block.
Uh-huh. And that's part of that community mindset that you want kids to have. And we get fulfillment when we serve. That's how God created us. When we can give back, we get fulfillment. So we don't want to rob kids of that. We want to give them opportunities. And then it's a blessing to us, just like it was to you, to see all those kids.
Exactly. And I want to say in reference to Stephanie, we need to teach our children that they need to be able to follow leadership no matter what that age is, because it has been a blessing for me to work under Stephanie. just to follow her lead. She's so enthusiastic and full of energy, and we draw that from other people.
Right.
Now, I could say, oh, I know a lot. I've lived a lot longer. Why do I have to do what she says? But she's in leadership, and I follow her lead no matter. So they've got to learn those lessons as well. We can learn from everybody, the younger, the middle, and the older.
That's right. Intergenerational relationships are really important. So
that's the word I was looking for. Intergenerational. Thank you.
And I am so thankful for those relationships. They are so filled with wisdom and different perspectives and different ideas, and I'm so thankful for them. Well, Dr. Melia, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We are so thankful for all of your wise words and helping us to understand how we can help our kids cope through this pandemic. We are so thankful for your time, and we at Champion Forest just want to say thank you.
Welcome. Thank you. Hope you have a great vacation Bible school.
Awesome. Thank you. We'll talk to you later. Parents, that was so awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you. And don't forget, you can share these with your friends, tag them in the post, and let them know how great these talks were. Thank you. We can't wait to see you at the drive-in.